Please help me welcome Jung Chang.
Thank you. Hello, thank you very much for coming. I think I will first of all say a few words about how I became a writer. I was born in China under Mao. And when I was growing up in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, I, in fact, always wanted to be a writer. But at that time, it was impossible to become a writer because nearly all writers were persecuted, driven to suicide, sent to the gulag, some were even executed. Even writing for oneself was dangerous. I remember I wrote my first poem in 1968 on my 16th birthday. I was lying in bed polishing my poem when I heard the door banging, and Red Guards had come to raid our flat. And if my poem was seen, it would bring disaster to my family as well as to myself. So I had to quickly rush to the toilet to tear up my poem and flush it down the toilet. But the desire to write never left me. In the following years, I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant. And when I was spreading manure in the paddy fields, and later when I became an electrician, and when I was checking electricity supplies on top of the poles, my mind will always be writing with an invisible pen. But I could not put pen to paper. And in 1976, Mao died, and things began to change. And in 1978, for the first time, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. And I sat for a national exam. I did reasonably well. So I became one of the first group of 14 people to go and study in Britain. As far as I was concerned, I was the first person to get out of Sichuan province, a province then of 90 million people, to go and study in the West. And when I arrived in Britain, and when I could write freely, at that moment I lost my desire to write, because to write would mean for me to look inward and backward, to look at a past I wanted to forget all about. In the Cultural Revolution, my father died. He was one of the few who stood up to Mao and protested the Cultural Revolution. And as a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane. He was exiled to a camp and died prematurely. And my grandmother, who really brought us up, and also died a sad death. And my mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father. She refused. And so as a result, she was put through over 100 of those ghastly denunciation meetings. Basically, the victims would be stood on the stage, their arms would be ferociously pushed to the back, and their heads were ferociously pushed down. And my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. She was paraded in the streets where children spat at her and threw stones at her. And she survived. Today, she still lives in Chengdu in China. So I mean, these things I didn't want to think about. In fact, when I was in Britain, I used to tell people when I first arrived I was from South Korea. So people want to ask me these questions I didn't want to answer. And the other reason I didn't want to write was also because I had come to a completely new world. It was like arriving on Mars. And I just wanted to soak up every minute of the new atmosphere. And when we first arrived, there are 14 of us. We were still wearing the Mao suits. We were not allowed to go out on our own. And we had to. This was the Chinese rule. Yeah, we had to go out in a group, so we were quite a sight in the London streets. And we were told not to do this, that, and the other. And in particular, we were told not to visit the English pub, because the Chinese translation for pub, 酒吧, suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. And I was, of course, torn with curiosity. I spotted the pub across the road from the college, and one day I sneaked out of the college. I dashed across the road. I pushed the door of the pub open, but of course I saw nothing of the kind, only some men sitting there drinking beer. I was rather disappointed, of course. And so for 10 years, I lived in excitement. And not wanting to write. But in 1988, my mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life, the stories of my grandmother and her relationship with my father. And once she started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months, and she talked every day. And by the time she left me, she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recordings. And when I was listening to her, I thought I've got to write all this down. And also I realized that it seems that my mother knew I had this unspoken dream of becoming a writer. And she was helping me to fulfill this dream, because when I was out working, she would be talking into a tape recorder. She was preparing, giving me the materials to become a writer. And so that's how I wrote Wild Swans. And as a result, I have become a writer. And my mother had said I made her very happy, because she said through writing Wild Swans, she felt that I had loved her and understood her more. And my mother was absolutely right. And so after Wild Swans became a sort of success, and I decided to write a biography of Mao. This was partly also to answer the many questions I had about Mao, which I wanted answer for. And then so Jung and I spent 12 years working on the biography of Mao. In 2005, I think we were here together presenting the Mao biography. We had divided our research by language. And because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And John, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. In particular, he knows Russian and spent years working on the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove. And as those of you who have read Mao probably could see that Russia, Stalin is written on every page of our biography of Mao. And John is still working on their relationship. After Mao was published, I then decided to write the Empress Dowager Cixi. I will later, if you're interested, I'll explain how I came to write about her. But of course, once I got into writing about the Empress Dowager, I was riveted, because I found another wonderful subject, because Mao was bad, but he was a very good subject. And the Empress Dowager was also a very good subject, and she was an amazing stateswoman as well. So this is the Empress Dowager, born in 1835 and wearing her Manchu robe. You can see the Manchus had, you can see her long fingernails. I just wanted to draw your attention to these long, long fingernails protected by bejeweled fingernail caps. And of course, in those days, the aristocratic Manchu women had many, many servants, hordes of servants, and they've never needed to dress themselves or do their own hair, so they were able to protect their long fingernails. And this was Beijing at her time. You can see city walls, camels, and of course they all disappeared. Now, at the age of 16, then Cixi, her name, Cixi Cixi went to one of those periodic nationwide celebrations for imperial consorts. Like hundreds of girls from all over China, she was paraded before the emperor, and she caught the eye of the emperor, and she was selected to be one of his concubines. An emperor was entitled to one empress and as many concubines as he wanted. And she was a low-rank concubine. And here is she playing chess with a eunuch who's standing. This is her husband, Emperor Xianfeng. Now, in 1860, Emperor Xianfeng and Cixi and the court had to flee Beijing to go north. And the reason was the British invaded. The British, through the Opium War, had got some ports for trade, and they wanted more ports for more trade. But Emperor Xianfeng, like his father, doggedly resisted Western effort to open up China and have more trade. And so the British then decided to come to Beijing to try to force him to do it, or to negotiate to do it. And then, but he fled, and the British then got into the old summer palace, Yuanmingyuan. I don't know if you heard of this giant compound of gardens and palaces. And the head of the expedition, Lord Elgin, who's the son of the Elgin marble, repute or disrepute, and then burned down the old summer palace. And today, you probably have seen the new summer palace, the summer palace today, and that is just one small part of the giant old thing. And Emperor Xianfeng was so heartbroken, he refused to return to Beijing even after the British had gone. And so he died in self-imposed exile in 1861 in the northern wilderness. He had only one son, and the son was Cixi, and the son became the next emperor. Oh, this is of course not their son. No, this is one of the ancestors of the Pekingese dog. Now, when the British got into the old summer palace, they found the body of an elderly imperial concubine who had not managed to escape with the court and had died of fright. And around her body were 5 dogs, Pekingese dogs. So the British brought them back and started to breed them. And this one was named Luti, and she was presented to Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria had Luti painted and specifically said she must be put next to something to show how extraordinarily small she was. And this picture came from Buckingham Palace. And there is a file about Luti in the Windsor Royal Archives, and all about how Luti refused to eat beef and milk and had to eat rice and chicken. And so that was Luti. Okay, now this is their son, the boy in blue, and playing with his elder sister, although the sister was older, but court paintings always portrayed him as twice her size. Now, this is Emperor Tongzhi. He was 5 years old, and okay, we'll forget about her. And 5 years, he was 5 years old, and Emperor Xianfeng then appointed 8 princes and other grandees to supervise him. At this point, Cixi launched a coup with the Empress. Cixi was a concubine, bear in mind. This was the Empress. So the 2 women, 125, 124, launched a coup and ousted these 8 powerful men. This is Cixi being carried to the morning audience by eunuchs. Now, they of the 8 men, they killed 3 of them. The head of the 8 men, they beheaded. And the other 2 princes were each sent a long white silk scarf for them to hang themselves with. And this was called the Cibo, which was considered the imperial favor. But Cixi's coup was a popular one. In fact, the British envoy, who is the younger brother of Lord Elgin, and said it was amazing that not a single man raised a finger to help these 8 powerful men who had in their disposition, in their possession, state machine and the army, and how the whole disturbance was less than the reshuffle of a ministry. And the reason was that the coup was popular because everybody felt China had to change. And Cixi was the first to come up with the idea of, which was, why must we resist the West coming to trade with us? Why can't we deal with the West and benefit China itself? And this common sense idea changed China. And Cixi and Empress Zhen then ruled in this audience hall behind the silk screen, because in those days there was strict segregation between men and women, and Cixi couldn't even talk to her officials face to face. So they were behind the screen. The officials would prostrate themselves in front of the throne, and the 5-year-old would, from time to time, being put on the throne. And this is the front part of the Forbidden City. I mean, those of you who have been to the Forbidden City would notice, the giant palaces, the vast ground, and treeless. It was by design. Trees were supposed to produce a soft feeling and reduce the sense of awe of the Forbidden City. And Cixi ruled China on and off, mainly on, for nearly half a century, between 1861 to 1908, when she died. She never set foot on this front part because she was a woman, and this was off the limits for women. And it was from this crippling handicap that she proceeded to change China. She was confined to, and all the women, the harem in the Forbidden City, and she hated it. She said it was all walls and gates. Now, of course, she had able and reformist men to help her. And the man in the middle is the most famous, Li Hongzhang, and many people considered him the biggest, the greatest reformer of China. But in fact, he was serving Cixi. He gave Cixi advice, carried out Cixi's orders, but he was not the ultimate decision maker. Here he was visiting Britain with Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister at the time, and Lord Curzon. and this okay, we forget about him. And this is this man at the end. We must not forget, because he's called Robert Hart. He was an ouster man, and Cixi employed him as soon as she came to power to be in charge of Chinese customs for the new, opened up trade. And for as long as she lived, he was in charge of the Chinese customs. He made very little recognized contribution to Chinese economy. And, he contributed as much as 1/3 of China's national revenue. And here is Robert Hart with his orchestra, Western orchestra of Chinese musicians. Now, standing in the middle is an American. I don't know whether you know him. He's called Anson Burlingame. He was President Lincoln's first minister to China after Cixi's coup, after China opened its door. And after his term ended, Cixi employed him as China's ambassador to the West. So he, with his delegation, his 2 deputies and 2 secretaries, 1 British, 1 French, and traveled the West for 2 years, more than 2 years, to tell the world China had changed. In New York, for example, he gave a speech to the citizens of New York, and he said, China has changed and China is now coming to you. Here you are facing, the representative of China. And he worked very hard for the interest of China, and he died while he was negotiating with the Tsar, with the Russian Tsar, on behalf of China. So, Anson Burlingame. And one of Cixi's reforms, and which she initiated many from the 1860s, what we have today, telegraphs, telephones, electricity, the railways, a modern navy, modern arms for the army, and so on. And one of them was to send these children to America to be trained in a comprehensive and systematic Western way. And these are one of the first groups of children. And when they went back to China, they became the pillars of China's modernization. A lot of China's modernizing projects were initiated and carried out by these boys who grew up in America, actually. Now, Cixi continued her reforms, but she had a problem. She always had to retire when the boy emperor came of age. Her only son, Emperor Tongzhi, took over the throne when he was 16. So Cixi went back to the harems, to the isolation of the harems. Emperor Tongzhi was 16, and he loved doing what the 16-year-olds were doing. He had no interest in modernizing projects. He had no interest in running the states, in fact. He loved sex. He also, loved frequenting brothels outside the Forbidden City. And so he sneaked out of the Forbidden City to frequent male as well as female prostitutes. And he died when he was 18. So at this point, Cixi then put a 3-year-old on the throne. The 3-year-old, the son of her sister, whom Cixi adopted as her own son, and she continued to sit behind the yellow silk screen to run the country, and she carried out more modernizing projects. But then the new emperor, the 3-year-old Emperor Guangxu, then grew up, and Cixi had to retire again in 1889. In fact, at the peak of China's modernization, when the major railway, the railway from Beijing to Canton, when the railway was built, and that railway was conceived to be the artery of Chinese economy that was going to get China out of poverty, and that railway is still the artery of Chinese economy today. Now, Cixi had retired. In fact, all the ambassadors, in particular the American ambassador, was together with others, got together and had a party and sung her praise. But Emperor Guangxu was educated in the old imperial way. He was, from the age of 4, he started to recite those Confucian classics, those incomprehensible, undigestible, dry to say the least, Confucian classics. And and he had no idea about the outside world, nor did he want to go even outside the Forbidden City, unlike his cousin who wanted to get out, even if to frequent brothels. Or Cixi, who was dying to travel but couldn't. Now, he was contented to be living like a prisoner in the Forbidden City. What he loved was to fiddle with watches and clocks. If you go to Forbidden City, you see lots of them. He was able to take them apart and put them back together. And now, he was a Confucian scholar, but he had no idea about the modern world. He was under the influence of his father figure, because Cixi was not a good mother. I won't go into details. There is a chapter about that. But he grew very close to this man, Wong Tonghe, who was a great scholar, great calligrapher, but a great conservative. He hated railways. He hated foreigners, calling them wolves and tigers. And he, of course, under his influence, Emperor Guangxu shelved the Cixi's modernizing projects, including the railway project, including modernizing the navy. And Japan, of course, seized this opportunity and pounced in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. On the one side, we have Japan with first-rate statesmen, and on the other, there was Emperor Guangxu, who rarely stepped out of the Forbidden City, a 20-something who was terrified of most of all thunders. So when there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs gathered to shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunders. And he made Wong Tonghe his primary war advisor. So, it doesn't take any in-depth analysis to see who would win and who would lose. And China, of course, lost spectacularly. Now, after the China's defeat, now Western powers then became completely contemptuous to China. Before that, they actually respected China. And then they suddenly found that this was a giant paper tiger. And so they started to treat China badly. And led by Germany, they started to grab a little bit of China, except America. Yeah. Germany grabbed the area around the Qingdao. I don't know if you've been to Chinese restaurants and had Qingdao beer, and that was because it was first produced by the Germans. And of course, with these occupations came confrontations, and around in the area where the Germans were rose the Boxers. You probably heard of the Boxers, saw the film 55 Days in Peking. And the Boxers were not all over China. They were only in Shandong, in the area where the Germans were. And only later on they got into Beijing. And when they got into Beijing, Western powers threatened invasion, and Cixi made to use her own word, a grave misguided judgment. Because she had no navy, no army, so she thought she could use the Boxers to fight the invaders. Of course, they couldn't. I mean, they waved their knives and chanted their gibberish, thinking they were immune to bullets. But of course, there are numerous memoirs, and of course, within 1 second, they were corpses. Now this is the allied army of 8 powers entering the Forbidden City. So Cixi was driven out of Beijing. Now, during her exile outside Beijing, Cixi reflected on the past and she repented. I mean, this was something that got my sympathy. I mean, of course, as Cixi was this, someone who grew out of medieval China, and she was capable of immense ruthlessness. Just before she left, she actually had this young girl drowned because imperial concubine Pearl was Emperor Guangxu's favorite concubine. Emperor Guangxu was by then under house arrest under Cixi because he was involved in a plot to assassinate her. And she was also involved. And Cixi fled in a hurry. She fled actually in a mule cart, and she was short of transport. She didn't want to take her along, so she ordered Pearl to commit suicide. Pearl refused, so Cixi ordered a eunuch to throw her down a well. If you go to the Forbidden City, you're inevitably going to be led to see the well where Cixi had Pearl drowned. But when so she reflected, she felt remorse, and when she returned to Beijing, the first thing she did was to honor Pearl. And this is Cixi returning to Beijing in 1902 because Cixi made peace with Western powers. Western powers realized that Cixi was actually not a West hater, and she was the only person who could hold China together. So they made peace, and she then returned to Beijing. And this is Cixi, with eunuchs getting out of a sedan chair, going into a hall, and waving at a foreign photographer who snatched this photograph. And Chinese monarchs traditionally must not be seen. When they were outside the Forbidden City, huge screens would erase to shield them from the onlookers. But Cixi learned from her envoys abroad that in the West, monarchs wave at their people. So she learned the wave. This is her first wave. And the Westerners then decorated this imperial locomotive for her return. In 1903, Cixi had her photographs taken. Now, this is a picture which she gave to the U.S. president as a present, and this is hung in the Blair House. This picture. From this picture, you could see she doesn't look nearly 70. She looked remarkably young. And she, in fact, all the negatives of Cixi's photos are in the States, are here in Washington, in the Freer Gallery archives. And what Cixi got, and here is the archivist. Anyway, what Cixi got, Cixi got and the Forbidden City got were prints, and the prints were airbrushed. So here we can see 1903 airbrush, and all these wrinkles were gone, bags were gone, eye bags were gone, and so she was thrilled. That's not what her mirror told her for years, and so she had them blown up to giant sizes and hung all over the palace. and she posed, and like here, like a coquettish girl putting a flower in her head. And also then Cixi then invited the photo studio chief to come into the court. And the chief of the photo studio wanted to make films. So Cixi put him together with her favorite opera singer. By the way, she also revolutionized the Peking opera and turning it from a village art form into the national opera of China. So she put these two together, who made China's first film in 1905. So Cixi could arguably be said to be China's first chief executive producer of films. Now, her life was tragedy, her personal life, of course. And this is her being supported by eunuchs. I mean, you can see these eunuchs were young, good-looking, and but every bit a good-looking young man. When she was in her late 20s and early 30s, so she fell in love with one of them, with tragic consequence, because the eunuch was beheaded, and the people who around them knew this were beheaded, and the eunuch's corpse was exposed for days, so the public could see he had no male organ, and that was the medieval China of the time. Now, but most importantly, Cixi, when she returned to Beijing, she initiated these reforms, which could be really called the real revolution of 20th century China. Her first decree was to ban foot binding. Now, in fact, that's how I first got interested in Cixi, when I was researching wild swans, because my grandmother had bound feet, and I, under communist education, had thought somehow the communists banned foot binding, until I realized that it was actually Cixi. I mean, you see, foot binding, my grandmother was my size, but her feet were this size. And foot binding was not just to put a piece of cloth around the feet. Only the big toe was allowed to grow. The other 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone. And the binding was just to stop the broken bones from recovering. Cixi herself didn't have foot binding because she was a Manchu. China's ruling dynasty was a Manchu dynasty. There were only 1% of the Chinese population, but they didn't have foot binding, and she hated foot binding. So her first decree was to ban foot binding. And then she introduced Western legal systems to replace antiquated Chinese penal laws, which included the banning of such punishments like death by 1,000 cuts. You heard of this, which meant to slowly slice the convicted to death. Which was a punishment she faced when she launched the coup initially, because that was the punishment prescribed for treason. And she established, brought in the new educational system. And what we have in China, in the Chinese world today, is not old Chinese educational system. It was new educational system based on Western models. And that she brought in. And there was a free press. Over 60 cities have journals, remarkably free, unprecedented, and arguably unsurpassed. Okay, now, and just before, not just before, in 1905, Cixi then launched a new project, that is to turn China into a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament. So Cixi was going to give the Chinese the vote. And of course, one of her goals was to ensure that her dynasty, this Manchu dynasty, would survive. apart from giving Chinese the vote, would survive. And before then, the dynasty, the people's obedience to the monarch could exist partly because of these rigid court rules. I mean, one rule was everybody must kneel in front of Cixi, if not, then standing. And it was because of this, Cixi, the only new thing she didn't enjoy. I mean, she was curious about all new things. She liked to try everything, and she rode a tricycle. She wanted to try a hot air balloon. But the only thing she didn't try, which she had, was a car, because there was no way the driver could drive kneeling or standing. And the driver had to sit right in front of her. So she then sacrificed her interest and never rode in a car. And then, of course, she realized that the dynasty just could not be propped up simply by these etiquette, by these rules. So she tried to introduce the constitutional or parliamentary monarchy. And unfortunately, she died in 1908. I think I'll stop here.